what are the real barriers, and what do advocates and physicians all need to understand about where you all see the greatest obstacles are in the collection process?
I would say the biggest obstacle is having, if you will, a process, an easy process that could be integrated, well integrated into what would normally happen in terms of patient flow. And that often translates into having a dedicated tissue procurement coordinator whose job it is to literally stand there with the beaker of liquid nitrogen or whatever to drive that process. And just remind them that this has to happen. And lastly, to convince pathology to indeed allow, to say, half the specimen to be banked for research purposes, but embargo that so that it can be pulled back for diagnostic purposes if necessary.
What happens to the patient who's not in a metropolitan area, the patient who's in a rural part of the country, which probably presents a whole other slew of obstacles and resistance?
There's two separate scenarios that we're talking about here. When you need molecular biology for your own diagnosis and defining your treatment, but one of the things that we really need desperately is to have good prospective biorepositories in this country to develop treatments that truly are targeted so that you have targets that match the molecular biology that you're talking about. And one of the things that in working pretty much 24/7 in this field for the last 7 years that becomes very evident, and if you go to OBBR you hear it a lot, is a lot of the research is done on tissue that has been in refrigerators and freezers for 10 and 20 years. You can't recontact patients, you know nothing about them, and a lot of the researchers report that the tissue might have sat unprotected in a container on the floor for 3 hours, then it goes to the lab where it might sit on a counter for 2 hours or the next day be processed. The minute the tissue leaves the body, it starts to degrade. So for us, in creating our biorepository, we were able to control every minute of the situation. I was talking to Steve because it's terribly expensive. It's $1 million from Komen a year, God bless them, and then I have to get $2 million, or our team has to get $2 million in kind of the physicians volunteer, the nurses, the phlebotomists, the people who run people through our system. If you do the molecular biology at the local level for diagnosis, you have to have a superb team or you're not going to get correct answers. If you want to create a biorepository, I think they have to be more centralized. And the theme of ASCO this year is that we all have to collaborate, we have to work together. The problem with tissue is it's siloed, and living in the middle of Indiana, I'm well aware of what a silo is. You put things in it, and then when you take it out, you sell it. Biorepositories need to be done exquisitely. I mean, it has to be as perfect as you can make it. You have to have a team. I think they need to be centralized so that you can really say, if somebody needs 300 samples, they get 300 samples that are apples to apples to apples. And thus we need fewer samples, shorter amount of time, better answers. So we're really talking about two separate scenarios.
There are thousands, literally thousands of what you call tissue banks around, where sitting in freezers and sub basements. But the biggest bugaboo on those are two. One is lack of standardization and collection, but more critically, lack of annotation. You don't know where these tissues are, the context they came in. And that is the sad reality. Most of these banks are close to useless.
In addition to what you mentioned about these multiple banks, we need outcome data too. You know, that's an important piece of tissue just by itself. If you don't know anything about the history of that tissue or what happened to the patient after, doesn't give us much information. But then the one thing we haven't really touched on is this is expensive stuff. As you said, for the normal bank, it's expensive. I work with a very small nonprofit, and a huge chunk of our budget goes to maintaining those tissues and handling them so that we can do it responsibly. And it takes a lot of money.
But if we do it right, and we do it under standard operating procedures, we will need far less tissue to get real answers, right, because we don't have this huge margin of error and number of years that we have to invest in it. The public's willing to do it. We just have to be heard. And it has to be understood that if you want it, we'll give it to you.
The most exciting thing about this, I think, is integrating this research aspect of understanding these drivers. This molecular testing is really bringing the basic science into clinical practice and marrying the two together, and the potential of that is huge. And being able to explain that to not only the patients, but also the team of physicians that's involved. One of the biggest problems that we hear from pathologists all the time is they don't get enough tissue, they don't get enough tissue. You know, getting the pathologist, the surgeon, the oncologist, and the patient all together on the same page, you know, working together to make this happen, to understand the potential of it.